Hi, everybody, and welcome to the certification exam rapid training for the SC-900 exam. This exam is intended to help you earn the Microsoft Certified Fundamental Certification. My name is Dave Branscombe. I'm a senior cloud security architect at Microsoft. I've been an MCSE on every version of Windows from NT4 through Windows Server 2012. And then I switched my focus almost entirely to cloud technology, Azure and Microsoft 365 technologies. The links for the video, as well as the content, are shown at the bottom of the slide, and there will also be at the end of the deck, or at the end of the video, a link that shows you where you can download the deck itself. So there's a couple goals with this session. First of all, I want to make sure that you understand the exam objectives as they are outlined by Microsoft at the link that's shown here, the aka.ms/SC900 link. I'll share a couple things that help me to prepare, areas where you might want to focus your attention as well. And hopefully this won't just be an academic exercise, but it'll give you some ideas for how to put these technologies into work in your own environment. In this particular deck, there's not a lot of animation, mostly just screenshots. But if you're viewing the deck in PowerPoint presentation mode, the next slide will allow you to click on an exam topic and skip straight to that section. If you happen to be doing the training over a series of sessions, you can click on one of the blue boxes and it'll take you immediately to that area of the deck. But we're going to go straight in order. The link on this slide takes you to the exam requirements as they are defined by Microsoft. So if you want an outline, you can download it from there. Now, taking and passing the SC-900 exam will earn you, as I mentioned, the Microsoft Certified Fundamental Certification. This is one of the newer exams in the Security and Compliance series of exams, which also includes SC-200, 300, and 400. All of which are focused on helping you to develop the skill set you need to manage security in a Microsoft environment. Now, at times, if you're familiar with Microsoft certification, sometimes Microsoft will group certifications together and you can earn a higher level certification like an MCSE. But as of today, that hasn't been defined for the SC certifications. Could change, but nothing publicly made known yet. There's a good study guide that's listed here from Charbel Nemnum. He is a Microsoft MVP for security, so you may want to take a look at that. The exam skills that are measured in this certification are really what I would consider to be a baseline set of skills for a person who is just learning about security in a Microsoft 365 or Azure environment. There's not going to be in this exam a lot of deep technical understanding that's required. I would say it's more targeted at helping you understand the concepts and getting started. Having said that, the exam is very broad in the technologies it covers, but again, it's not particularly deep. So you'll be tested on things like identity, endpoint security, Office 365 security, Azure network security, but it's not going to be at the same depth as the other three exams that I mentioned before, the SC-200, 300, and 400. So what's the best way to prepare for the exam? Well, you've taken the first step, and that is getting to know the exam objectives. You'll want to study the Microsoft documentation related to the exam objectives. I've shown you where that can be located with those AKA links. As of today, the date this video is being created, there aren't any practice exams available for the SC-900. But if one becomes available, and you can usually look those up online, I would suggest that you take one of those as preparation. The practice exam writers are usually very good at simulating the types of questions and the types of content that are going to be covered in the exam. So it's a good way to practice. But more than the practice exams, really the better you know the product itself from working with it, the better your chances are of passing the exam. So I took the exam during its beta period, And I was able to pass fairly easily simply because I work with the technology every day. So it was very familiar to me. So really, the more you practice with the technology, the better your chances are of passing the exam. There are also, as we see here on the page on the links here, some free learning paths available that you can take for the SC-900 exam. These are fantastic resources for exam preparation, and they're free. So it will take a little bit of time to go through them, but once you go through them, you've got a good basis for the exam preparation. And they even allow you to track your progress through the courses, as well as giving you knowledge checks every so often, so you can make sure that you're actually remembering the things that you're learning. Okay, let's go into our first area of education. This is the concept of security, compliance, and identity. Now, the content is fairly light in this section. That's less than 10% of the exam, but there are some key topics that you probably will get questions about. So you will need to pay attention to those. The first area of this section deals with understanding some fundamental security concepts that Microsoft emphasizes with customers. And the first is zero trust. Now, with the zero trust model, you have three principles that underpin how security is implemented in a Microsoft network. The first is explicit verification of identities. The second is granting least privileged access. And the third is assume breach. So the concepts in zero trust are emphasized repeatedly in Microsoft training and documentation. So you should expect to get at least one question that covers this topic. It is important. The second area is the shared responsibility model. And the shared responsibility model is what's depicted here in the image. It helps to define which security tasks are handled by the cloud provider, for example, Microsoft or AWS, and which security tasks are handled by you, the customer, indicated here in blue. So as you see on the right-hand side of the graphic here, if you're an organization that's running purely on-premises hardware and software, your organization is 100% responsible for implementing security and compliance. On the other side of the graphic, something like SaaS, so you think of something like Office 365, the responsibility is shifted more heavily over to the cloud provider and less on the customer, right? So Microsoft is responsible for all this stuff in gray, and then the customer is responsible for the blue things. And then there's PaaS and IaaS, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, that have, again, correspondingly differing ways of allocating responsibility. But the shared responsibility model is important to know. The third area is defense in depth. And this concept of defense in depth is not something new to Microsoft. It's been around for quite a while. And the idea is that we use a layered approach to security rather than relying on a single perimeter, such as your firewall. The defense in depth strategy uses a series of mechanisms or controls to slow an attacker's advance through your network. So each layer is going to provide protection so that if that layer is breached, then the next layer creates an additional obstacle for an attacker to keep them from getting to their ultimate objective, which is getting unauthorized access to your data. There are a variety of different types of security threats, and you may be tested on your knowledge of some of these in the exam. So for some of them, for some of the attacks or threats, the goal is to steal data. For others, it's about extortion, getting money from their victims. For others, the goal is just disrupting normal operations, such as a denial of service attack. So this particular topic will test your basic knowledge of these types of threats. You're not going to need to understand how to perform an attack or even how to defend against the attack, but you will need to understand what the attack is trying to do and the basic idea behind the attack. So data breaches. So a data breach is when data is stolen, and this includes corporate data, but it can also include personal data. Some common ways that can result in a data breach include things like phishing or spear phishing. We'll talk about these in a minute. Tech support scams, where someone contacts you and says they're from Microsoft tech support. SQL injection attacks, malware that's designed to steal passwords, and so on. With dictionary attacks, this is a type of identity attack where an attacker will try to steal your identity by attempting to authenticate using a large number of known passwords, either stolen passwords or very guessable passwords. Each password is tested using automation against a known username, and sometimes these are known as brute force attacks. Ransomware is very common these days. It's a type of malware that will encrypt your files and folders and render them useless to you, the owner of those things. It prevents access to those files. And then what the attacker will do is try to extort money from you, usually in the form of like a cryptocurrency, in exchange for giving you the decryption key so you can unlock your files. DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks. The idea here is that an attacker will send so many requests to a web page or a server or an application that the application can't process those requests anymore, and it just becomes unavailable. It just falls over. There's other common types of threats, including things like rootkits, exploit kits, coin miners that attempt to take over your infrastructure so that the attacker can attempt to mine Bitcoin, as an example. Trojans and worms. It's important to understand the difference between these two. So Trojans are a type of malware that either have to be downloaded manually or there's another piece of malware that downloads them and installs them. They're called Trojans because they'll often use the same file name as a real legitimate application or service, so they can hide in your system and you may not even know that they're there because they look like something that's legitimate. So for example, they might hide under the name service host or notepad.exe. So they would look like something that's legitimate, but they're not. A worm, on the other hand, copies itself and spreads through a network by exploiting security vulnerabilities in the operating systems that it's attacking. It can spread through email attachments, text messages, file sharing programs, social networking sites, removable USB drives. There's a variety of different ways that worms can infect a network. And one way that an organization can reduce the impact of these types of security threats or mitigate the effects of them is to use encryption. So you encrypt sensitive or valuable data, and what you're doing there is making the data unreadable and unusable to an unauthorized viewer. In order to use or read that encrypted data, it has to be decrypted, and that requires the use of a secret key. There are two top level types of encryption. There are symmetric and asymmetric types of encryption. So I would encourage you to go to this link and just understand the difference between symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. Again, it can be a complicated topic to understand, but you're not going to need to be able to explain it in detail. Just understand when a described scenario is using symmetric or when it's using asymmetric encryption. With encryption, we can also protect data at rest or data that is in transit. So for example, HTTPS or TLS protects the traffic that you send and receive when you visit a website. Microsoft's products and solutions run on trust. Microsoft focuses on these 6 key privacy principles when making decisions about the use of data. So they are control, transparency, security, the legal protections that are afforded by the government of the country where the data center or the owner of the data lives, the principle of no content-based targeting, and then lastly, the benefit to you of the data collection. So when Microsoft collects data, it should be used to benefit you and to make your experiences better. The Service Trust Portal is something that you should probably become familiar with. So in the Service Trust Portal, as one example, you can access an area called the trust documents. And in the trust documents, you can find links to things like penetration tests, security assessments, audit reports that have been done against Azure or Office 365 or other Microsoft properties. You can also go there to find out about how a specific control is implemented or designed in the cloud services. In the Service Trust Portal, you can also view compliance information about the Microsoft Cloud services organized by, for example, an industry. So you could look up how Microsoft meets the compliance needs of a healthcare organization or a financial services organization. But you can also find out information about how Microsoft meets regional compliance requirements like GDPR, for the countries and regions where Microsoft has data centers and where we operate. So let's go into our second topic, and this is related to identity and access management. This is going to make up about 25 to 30% of the exam, so you're definitely going to want to spend some time understanding the topics in this section. But again, it's not going to be as comprehensive or deep technically as the SC-300 exam. That's the one that focuses exclusively on identity and access management and goes into detail about how to configure it and set it up. The first concept to remember is that enterprise security needs to adapt to the reality that the security perimeter can no longer be viewed as the on-premises network. So things like the firewalls, the IDS, the IPS devices, you have to protect services, data, and identity out into things like SaaS applications like Office 365 or Salesforce or G Suite. These are hosted outside your corporate network, so your firewall is not going to do much good in protecting those applications. In many cases, you have to protect the personal devices of your employees, and they may be accessing corporate resources while they're working from home or working remotely while traveling. There are also identities for partners and customers that are accessing corporate data, your corporate data, or collaborating with your employees, and you have to protect their data, but also you have to ensure that they do not get access to things that they shouldn't have on your internal network. So the point that's being made here is that the traditional model of exclusively basing our security on a perimeter that's made up of firewalls is not enough. Identity has become the new security perimeter that helps an organization to secure their assets and data. You'll also need to understand the difference between authentication, in other words, who are you, and authorization, what are you allowed to do? So authentication is the process of proving that you are who you say you are. And authorization is the act of granting an authenticated entity permission to do something. So it specifies what data you're allowed to access and what you're able to do with that data. Now, building a little bit on this identity topic, we need to understand what an identity provider is. So an identity provider is a service that allows you to create or manage or maintain identity information, and it's going to generally offer those services that we talked about on the previous slide. So authentication, authorization, and usually they're going to provide an auditing capability as well. So being able to track what happened in some kind of a log. With most modern applications, the information that's used to authenticate a user with the service is stored and managed centrally by the identity provider. So the identity provider allows an organization to establish policies governing your authentication and authorization requirements, and then you can monitor user behavior to make sure it's in line with those requirements. You can identify suspicious activities, and by identifying those suspicious activities, hopefully you can reduce the number of identity-based attacks. So an identity provider, what are identity providers? So Microsoft Azure Active Directory is an example of a cloud-based identity provider, but it's not the only one. There are others. So for example, Google or Amazon or LinkedIn or GitHub are sometimes used as identity providers. So you want to make sure that you understand the difference between the different flavors of Active Directory if they're mentioned in a question. So all three of these services have Active Directory in the name, but that doesn't mean that they're all the same or that they have the same functionality. Azure Active Directory, or AD domain services, is probably the most familiar IDP for most organizations because this is what they have sitting in their data center, right? They have domain controllers. They use those domain controllers to provide core user account authentication and the ability to manage their computers. Azure AD Domain Services is a little bit different. It's a managed domain service. So it is a set of services that run in Azure, which make sure that some of the traditional on-premises AD features, so things like domain join, group policy, the ability to use LDAP or Kerberos or NTLM authentication, that those are available in a cloud-based service. So Active Directory is traditionally an on-premises directory service. Azure AD Services takes some of those services and moves them to the cloud. The third area is Azure Active Directory, which is what the bulk of this exam will be focused on, in terms of identity at least. It is a cloud-based identity and mobile device management service. It gives you the ability to manage user account and authentication services for things like Microsoft 365, the Azure portal, and even third-party SaaS applications. You can actually synchronize your on-premises Active Directory identities into Azure Active Directory so that you only have a single identity, whether the user is authenticating to resources on premises or if they're authenticating to resources in the cloud, for example, Office 365. So it's the same identity in either location. The last area here is federation. And federation allows an organization to give access to resources or services across organizational or domain boundaries. The way it does this is by establishing trust relationships between identity providers. And that's what we see here. With a federated environment, there's no requirement for a user to maintain a different username and password when accessing resources in other domains. So an example of federation is if you log into a social media site, let's say it's Instagram, and I don't know that this is the authentication mechanism that's used or anything. It's just an example. Let's say you want to log into Instagram, and you can log into Instagram using your Google username and password. So you've got a username and password in Google. So in this scenario, you had this account with Google, so they are your identity provider, but Instagram might not be using Google for their identity provider. Maybe they're using Azure Active Directory. Again, I don't know that this is the case. But in that scenario, there is a trust relationship established between Azure AD and Google. And because that trust relationship exists, Instagram can say, okay, I'll allow users to log into my services even though they aren't in my Azure Active Directory, because I trust Google as an identity provider. So your account and password exist in Google, and because Azure Active Directory trusts Google, then that authentication mechanism allows you to authenticate to Instagram. And Facebook is another commonly used authentication provider or identity provider. All right, so we touched on this a few slides ago about the different threats that we might face. So this is talking about some common identity-based attacks. So password-based attacks include things like password spray. And that's what's depicted here, a password spray attack. An attacker will select a easily guessable or a known compromised password like summer 2016. And he'll just go down the list and he'll say, I want to try this password against Joe. I want to try this password against Louise. I want to try this password against Glenn. Oh, I have a match. Glenn uses the password summer 2016. Now I can authenticate as Glenn and get access to his resources and get inside the organization. So that's the idea behind a password spray. Phishing. Phishing is a type of attack where an attacker will send an email that appears to come from a reputable source. The email will attempt to describe a credible story, such as a security breach. And it will tell the user to sign in and change their password. So it might say, you know, your bank account credentials or your bank account information has been compromised. Please log in here and change your password. That website is under the control of the attacker. And so when you log in and enter your username and password, that then becomes known to the attacker and they can compromise your information. Spear phishing builds on that idea. And in this type of scenario, what happens is the attacker is targeting a specific individual. So it might be the CFO of a company. And so they're going to try to collect information about that user so that they can create a much more credible phishing email. The email might appear to come from someone in their organization who's requesting information about a vendor payment or a change in bank account numbers or something like that. And because they're carefully crafted to sound legitimate, the recipient may not read it carefully enough, and they'll send the requested information or log onto a website before they even recognize that there's a fraud being perpetrated. So getting back to Azure Active Directory, if we dig a little bit deeper into this, and remember, this Azure Active Directory is not the same as your Active Directory on premises. You don't need to deploy domain controllers for Azure AD. It's a cloud service managed entirely by Microsoft. In fact, if you have Office 365 or if you're using Exchange Online, the identity service that is backing those cloud services and that allows you to authenticate to them is Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory manages different types of entities, whether it's users, devices, groups, service principals, and so on. A user identity is a representation of someone or something that needs to authenticate to Azure Active Directory. So employees, guests, as you see here, a bot may have an identity and be represented by a user account in Azure AD. If you have several users that need access to the same type of resource, you might create a group. So the group might be all employees, it might be finance, accounting, IT, whatever it is. You create a grouping of users that have the same access needs. A service principal is a security entity that is used by an application or a service in order to access specific Azure resources. So you can kind of think of this as an identity for an application. So that's what a service principal is generally used for. One of the things, as I mentioned, that you can do with Azure Active Directory is integrate it with your on-premises Active Directory. Most organizations have this type of setup, most organizations of any size. So once you get past a couple hundred users, this is probably the scenario that you're working in. Basically, what you're doing is you're synchronizing the user accounts and groups that exist in your on-premises Active Directory with your domain controller. So you're taking those users, those groups, and you're synchronizing them into Microsoft Azure Active Directory. This allows you to provision and manage users in a single location rather than managing a directory here on premises and also managing a directory of the same user accounts here in Azure Active Directory. So you could, for example, have your authoritative identity resource as maybe your HR system. That's the source of truth. That's where users are created and where they're deleted. That could synchronize to Active Directory, and then Active Directory could synchronize to Azure Active Directory. Any user account that's created in HR is created in both of these directories. Any user account that's deleted from HR is deleted from these directories. So when you have this type of scenario where you've got a blend of on-premises and cloud identity, you have what we call hybrid identity. There's a couple different scenarios that you can configure for hybrid identity depending on your business needs. So you can use password hash sync, pass-through authentication, or as we described a few minutes ago, the idea of federation. Now, you're not likely in the exam to be asked how to set any of these up, but I would recommend that you at least review this document or this page so that you understand what is accomplished by using password hash sync, what is accomplished by using pass-through authentication or federation. That way you understand the scenarios that each one of these would help to satisfy in a design situation. If you switch gears a little bit and move over to external identities, with external identities in Azure AD, you can allow people outside your organization to access your applications and resources, but you still allow them to sign in using their preferred identity provider. So you may be working with partners or distributors, suppliers, vendors, external users, whatever it is. And effectively, they can bring their own identity. So whether they have a corporate or government assigned identity, or if they're using a social media identity like Google or Facebook, they can use that identity to authenticate to your Azure AD. And so the external user's identity provider, Google or Facebook, manages their identity, but you manage access to your applications within Azure Active Directory. So you can keep your resources protected, but you don't manage their username and password. That's managed by their identity provider. You're just granting that user account access to things that you have security responsibility for. The authentication methods that are available in Azure AD are also covered at a fairly high level. So with this topic, we're talking about things like self-service password reset, how Azure AD protects your passwords, multi-factor authentication, Windows Hello for Business. Self-service password reset is exactly what it sounds like. It gives users the ability to change or reset their password. They don't have to get an administrator or the help desk involved. Password protection. So by default, Azure AD will block the use of weak passwords or compromised passwords. So for example, if a user tries to use the password password1, there is a global banned password list that is automatically updated and enforced on your tenant that includes known weak or compromised passwords. So if an Azure AD user tries to set their password to one of those compromised passwords, they'll get a notification that says, no, you need to pick a different password. In addition to that, if you want to increase the security, you can define what is called a custom password protection policy. So a custom password protection policy uses filters to block variations of passwords that contain a name that might be commonly used within your organization. So let's say, for example, your company's name is Contoso. You might not want your users to use a password that contains the word Contoso because that might be easily guessed by an attacker. So you would include Contoso as one of the banned passwords in your custom password protection policy. And that would prevent users from using that type of password. Multi-factor authentication is a capability where a user is prompted during the sign-in process for an additional form of identification. So maybe they're asked to approve a request on an authenticator app or use a verification code, respond to a text message or answer a phone call. So it's a way of doing more than simply relying on a password for authentication. It provides a second form of authentication. Windows Hello for Business is a capability available in Windows 10 that enables users to sign in using a biometric type of authentication, maybe your facial recognition or a fingerprint. You can also use a PIN when you're logging in with Windows Hello. Definitely you'll want to understand the concept of conditional access. So conditional access is a capability within Azure Active Directory that allows you or allows an organization to take the signals that come from a user account. In other words, where is the user logging in from? Is this an area that they've logged in from frequently, or is this the first time that we've seen them try to log in from here? What is the device that they're logging in from? Is it a corporate managed device, or is it their personal iPad? Takes those signals, and then it says, what are you trying to access? Well, I'm trying to access Exchange or Teams or something over here. And so it's going to take the signals, look at what you're trying to access, and make a policy decision about what needs to be done in order to grant the user access to these things based on these signals. So as an example, if we have a person from payroll, they may be trying to access the payroll application, but they're accessing it from their home location on their personal device. So the conditional access policy may say, okay, I will let the user from payroll on their home device access the payroll system, but in order to do that, I'm going to require that they perform a second set of authentication or perform MFA. So some of the common use cases for conditional access would include something like if you have a user that is trying to perform an elevated privilege task. So maybe they're creating user accounts or changing passwords. You may require that elevated privilege task to prompt the user for multi-factor authentication before they can do that. Or if the user is attempting to log in using an authentication method that's legacy, so maybe they're trying to access their email through IMAP or POP, you might say, no, I'm going to block access entirely for that type of scenario. Or if the user is trying to log in from a specific country, you might say, no, there's no reason that any of my users should be logging in from that country. I'm going to block access. So that's conditional access and some of the use cases that you might think about when designing a conditional access environment. Azure AD roles. Azure AD roles are based on RBAC, and what they do is, or RBAC is role-based access control. And what this allows you to do is grant granular permissions to your admins. And by doing that, it allows you to follow the principle of least privilege. Remember, we talked about zero trust. So giving your users the least amount of privilege they need to accomplish their task. That means that you could assign the role of Exchange Hygiene Administrator to a user named Sally. That means that Sally could perform a very limited set of tasks in Exchange that is related to spam filtering. But that's all she can do in Exchange. Now, keep in mind that Azure AD roles apply specifically to Azure AD resources. They're not the same as the roles and access that you would grant to someone who is managing, for example, an Azure virtual machine or Kubernetes or containers. That's a different set of RBAC roles. Identity governance and identity protection. So identity governance helps an organization to strike a balance between productivity. In other words, how quickly can we enable a user to have access to the resources they need to do their job, such as when they join an organization, and balance that against the need for security. So how do we manage their access to these things over time as their role changes, the person's employment status changes, right? So you start off here at the point where they have no access and they get their first job role and they get access to a certain amount of things. But maybe they go to a second job role and they no longer need access to these resources. How do we manage that life cycle of access all the way through, retiree and, no longer an employee? That's the idea behind identity lifecycle management and identity governance. Azure Active Directory entitlement management is an identity governance feature that allows organizations to manage identity and access lifecycle at scale. So not managing it one user at a time manually, but automating access request workflows, access assignments, granting access or performing access reviews, and even expiring access that the user has. So what is an access review? When you have an access review, the organization is able to manage group memberships, the access that users have to enterprise applications, and so on. So a user's access can be reviewed on a regular basis, maybe every 6 months, maybe a year, to ensure that they only have access to the things that they need access to. Now, this is one of those areas where it might be valuable to you to understand how to license your users, because access reviews don't necessarily follow the logic that you might use with other services or applications. So I would suggest that you read over the access review license scenario and understand how you would apply licensing in the case of implementing access reviews. And as with just about any other topic in this entire presentation, right, it's always good to know what the minimum permissions are that are needed to accomplish any given task. Privilege Identity Management, or PIM. Privilege Identity Management is a capability or a service in Azure AD that lets you manage, control, and monitor access to important resources in your organization. So these resources include resources in Azure AD, in Azure, Microsoft 365, Microsoft Intune, any of those properties. The basic idea here is that you can say that a user named Bob is allowed to request access to a privileged administrative role. And when he requests that access, the request has to be approved by his manager. Once the manager approves the request, then Bob is given those privileges for, let's say, 2 hours. And then at the end of that 2-hour period, those privileges are automatically revoked, and Bob is back to a standard user account. And if he needs to perform those tasks for a little bit longer, he has to go through the same request process. So the idea here is that it's a way of ensuring that people don't have standing administrative privileges to any services. PIM is one of the areas, again, where it's a good idea to understand the licensing requirements for setting things up and how you'd manage users that fall under the purview of PIM. Azure AD Identity Protection is a tool that allows organizations to automate the detection and remediation of identity-based threats. They can then investigate those risks using the data in the Azure portal, or they can export that data to a third-party utility or a SIM like Azure Sentinel or Splunk or whatever for additional analysis. One thing that I would suggest that you make sure you're comfortable with is understanding the different types of risks. By this, I mean, what is the difference between a risky user and a risky sign-in? So they might sound like the same thing, but they're not. So make sure you understand the difference between a risky user and a risky sign-in. They're slightly different. All right, moving on to the third topic area, the capabilities of security solutions. This is, again, going to take up quite a bit of your time, the bulk of your time for preparation for the exam, because it does cover a lot of different technologies. So one of the first things to get familiar with are some basic Azure networking security technologies. Azure Network Security Groups. So network security groups can be used to filter network traffic to and from different Azure resources in an Azure virtual network. So the network security group is going to contain things like security rules. So you can deny inbound network traffic to, or you can block outbound traffic from different types of Azure resources. And then for each of those rules, you can specify a source and destination port and protocol. Azure DDoS protection. This is a way to protect your Azure resources against denial of service attacks. So it's automatically tuned to help protect your specific Azure resources in a virtual network. And you don't have to do anything to the applications or the resources that are running. The Azure DDoS protection accounts for that. And you don't have to tweak the application, for example, in order to accommodate DDoS protection. The last one that's mentioned here is Azure Firewall, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a managed cloud-based network security service, protects your Azure network resources. It is a fully stateful firewall, and because it is in Azure, it has built-in high availability and unrestricted cloud scalability. A couple other things that you're going to want to know conceptually what they are. Azure Bastion. That's what's depicted here. Azure Bastion is a service that you deploy that lets you connect to your virtual machines using just a browser and the Azure portal. So the Azure Bastion service is a fully platform managed PaaS service that you provision inside your Azure virtual network. And what this does is it gives you a almost like a jump box that allows you to provide to have secure either RDP or SSH connectivity to the virtual machines in your virtual network from the Azure portal using TLS. So when you connect using Azure Bastion, what this allows is it allows you to avoid assigning public IP addresses to your Azure VMs. You don't have to put any agents on them. You don't have to have any special client software. The Azure Bastion service is what you use to connect to those machines. The second area is Web Application Firewall. And this is a way to provide centralized protection for your web applications against things like SQL injection attacks or cross-site scripting. As we talked about at the beginning of the session, Azure and Office 365 do provide a number of ways that data can be encrypted in different layers. And so we recommend that for any service that you deploy, at least consider encrypting the data to ensure its security. Azure Security Center. So Azure Security Center is a unified security management system that helps you to strengthen the security posture of your data center, and it gives you guidance and alerting about different threats that your workloads in the cloud might be facing, whether those resources are in Azure or, as we see here, in AWS, Google Cloud, even if the resources are housed in infrastructure that is on premises. Azure Security Center can give you visibility into their security status. So there's two main goals with Security Center. First of all, is to help you understand your current security situation, and then help you to improve your security situation. The central feature in Security Center that helps you achieve those goals is Azure Secure Score. So Security Center is continually evaluating and assessing the resources that you have in your cloud services or your on-premises services looking at the subscriptions that you have, and looking for security issues. It then aggregates all those findings into a single score so that you can tell at a quick glance your current security situation. And the higher the score that you are showing here, then the lower the identified risk level. So a higher score is better. It means that you're implementing more security controls. And we have a similar concept for compliance. So you can apply compliance policies to your Azure infrastructure, and then the compliance score shows how you're meeting those compliance regulations. Azure Defender for Servers is the threat detection and advanced defense capability for your Windows and Linux machines. So if you're using Linux machines, Azure Defender is pulling audit records using the cont'd service that's running in Linux. Now, there's a phrase here and an acronym that many folks aren't real familiar with. It's not a very commonly used one: Cloud Security Posture Management. So if you have a team that's working on Cloud Security Posture Management, their objective is to report on and improve the security posture of your organization. And the way they do this is by focusing on disrupting a potential attacker's return on investment. What we mean here is that if you can make it too expensive for the attacker to compromise your environment, it's possible that they'll move on to an easier target. Now, that's not always going to be true. There are some targets that, for example, a nation state, they don't really care about what the cost is to compromise them. They'll expend any amount of resources to get there. But that's not always the case. There may be standard criminal organizations or groups that are just trying to compromise anybody. And if it's too expensive for them to accomplish that, they may move on. Security baselines. These focus on cloud-centric control areas. So they typically follow well-known security benchmarks. For example, the Center for Internet Security, or CIS. These security baselines can be applied to your Azure environment. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about Sentinel. And you'll need to understand what a SIEM, a SOAR, and an XDR service are. So SIEM, or SIEM, depending on how you want to pronounce it. This stands for Security Incident and Event Management. So a SIEM system is a tool that an organization uses to collect alert data from across their environment. That may be on premises, it may be cloud. It may include hardware, but also software and other types of services. And the SIEM will then perform analysis on the data that it's getting. It'll look for oddities or anomalies, and it will generate alerts to your security operations team, and they can respond to those alerts. A SOAR system, or Security Orchestration and Automated Response system, can take the alerts that a SIEM generates and can trigger an automated workflow or a process that attempts to mitigate that issue. So it sees an alert and then it tries to automate a response to that alert. XDR is Extended Detection and Response. So an XDR system is designed to deliver intelligent, automated, and integrated security across an organization's domain. So it's intended to prevent, detect, and respond to threats across a variety of different services and tools. So identities, endpoints, applications, email, IoT devices, cloud platforms. And so Azure Defender and Microsoft 365 Defender provide that XDR capability because they protect many different platforms and services. So if you're going to be able to provide a comprehensive security perimeter, an organization has to be able to implement a solution that either combines all three of these capabilities, the SIEM, SOAR, and XDR, or at least has integration between different vendors, for example. Microsoft 365 Defender. So Defender is Microsoft 365 Defender is a set of services, a unified defense suite of services, and it coordinates threat detection, prevention, investigation, and response across things like your identities, your endpoints, your Office 365 applications, and helps to provide protection against some of the more sophisticated attacks. So if we go through each of these Defender components, first one is Microsoft Defender for Identity. Now, previously, this was known as Azure Advanced Threat Protection, or Azure ATP. So Defender for Identity is a cloud-based security solution that leverages your on-premises Active Directory signals to identify either threats or compromised identities, malicious insider actions, things that are happening within your organization. So it can identify things like pass the hash attacks, golden ticket attacks, RDP and brute force types of attacks, specifically targeting your on-premises organization. One of the things that you're likely to need to know is what is required in your on-premises environment to get this set up. So what are the components that have to be installed on premises in order for Defender for Identity to work? Defender for Office 365 protects your organization against the types of malicious threats that are posed by email messages, links, attachments, collaboration tools. So again, this used to be called Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection, ATP, and there are two plans for Defender for Office 365. They're Plan 1 and Plan 2, and the way I remember what's included in each of those plans is Plan 1 is primarily focused on prevention of attacks, and Plan 2 is focused on automating a response or educating your organization about the threats. So prevention for Plan 1, automation and education for Plan 2. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint is your endpoint security platform to help prevent, detect, investigate, respond to advanced threats. Now, some people think that Defender for Endpoint is an antivirus product. It does have that component, but it is much more than antivirus. It also integrates with other products like Cloud App Security and Azure Information Protection to provide visibility into, as an example, the applications that are installed on an endpoint, the cloud applications that a user is connecting to from that endpoint, the protected data, the Azure Information Protected data that resides on that machine, and so on. So there's much more to it than simply antivirus. Understand the licensing requirements and the hardware and software requirements for Defender for Endpoint for deploying to those machines. The last one here is Cloud App Security. This is what we refer to as a Cloud Access Security Broker. It's used to analyze what cloud applications people in your organization are using, and it can allow you to exercise control over the data movement to those third-party cloud applications. So, for example, if you see confidential data being stored in a box or Dropbox location where it shouldn't be, then you have the ability to prevent the user from doing that or perform some other type of automated response to that activity. The Microsoft 365 Security Center. This, again, helps you to provide protection, detection, investigation, and response capabilities for email, collaboration, identity, and device threats. And it does this within a single portal. So it's important to know this because the Security Center brings together the functionality that had been in separate security portals, like the Microsoft Defender Security Center for endpoints and the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. So the Security Center emphasizes the ability to quickly access information, gives you some simpler layouts to read, and brings that information together for easier use. Now, the other portals do still exist, but this 365 Security Center can be a starting point for access to those resources. And those portals are slowly being merged into the Security Center as one holistic area for investigation. Microsoft 365 Secure Score is very similar to the tool that we saw before, the Azure Secure Score. So it is a measure of an organization's security posture. Higher numbers indicate more improvement actions have been taken. And we see the improvement actions here, what the value of those improvement actions, what the status of them is, and you can take actions based on that. Now, depending on what your organization's subscription includes, the security dashboard and the security reports that are available could include several different widgets or panes. So you might have the threat management summary, as you see up here, the threat protection status. You may see global weekly threat detections. You may see trends for malware, what malware families are most prevalently observed, and so on. You will also need to understand at a high level how Microsoft 365 protects endpoints. And really, there's two components to how this is done, depending on the environment that you're working in and how you've been licensed. If you want to manage everything in the cloud, Microsoft Intune is the service that focuses on a purely cloud infrastructure. So it gives you the ability to manage your mobile devices, manage your mobile applications. You can control the configuration of your devices, including things like your mobile phones, tablets, laptops. You can manage how they can be used. You can configure security policies to control applications. And as you see here, specific security controls that exist for machines can be applied through Microsoft Intune as well. Now, Microsoft Endpoint Manager includes the services and tools that you would use to manage and monitor devices in a hybrid environment. So you have some on-premises and some cloud. So you could use Endpoint Manager to manage your mobile devices using like the Intune aspect. But then you could use the Configuration Manager to manage desktop computers, VMs, servers, even embedded devices. So you can actually combine services that you're using. So you got Microsoft Intune, Config Manager, Desktop Analytics, Windows Autopilot, and so on. So these services are part of the Microsoft 365 stack to secure, protect your data, and respond to and manage risk. So if you want to get a little hands-on with Microsoft Endpoint Manager, I'd recommend that you play with this interactive guide, and it'll help you understand what is possible with Endpoint Manager. Our last section is addressing the compliance solutions that exist in Microsoft 365, as well as a little bit of Azure. Again, there's a lot of tools in this section, so make sure to spend some time getting to know them. The Microsoft 365 Compliance Center is a way to have access to the data and tools you need to manage your organization's compliance needs. So it is a compliance tool homepage. Compliance Manager awards you points, just like with the other S.C.E.R.T tools. It gives you points for completing improvement actions that bring you closer to compliance with a regulation or a standard or policy, and then it combines those points into an overall compliance score. Each action has a different impact on your score depending on the potential risks that you're mitigating by implementing that control. Your compliance score can also help you prioritize which actions to focus on in order to improve your overall compliance posture. Now, a big part of properly implementing compliance is applying controls and governance to your data. And in order for that to happen, you have to understand your data. You have to know where it is, what it is, who's accessing it, and so on. Data classification is tasked with that responsibility. So even if you have a large data estate of documents and emails, if you go to the overview of the data classification pane in the Compliance Center, you can see things like the number of items classified as sensitive information, which classifications were applied to them, the locations of the data based on their sensitivity label. You can even get a summary of the actions that users are taking on that sensitive content across your organization. And then you can dig deeper into things like the Content Explorer and Activity Explorer to get more granular information. So with the Content Explorer, you have visibility into the content that was summarized back in the overview pane. So we got an overview here in this tab. And then once we dig into the Content Explorer, we see the specific documents, the labels that have been applied to them, what type of sensitive information was contained in those documents, and so on. If we flip over to the Activity Explorer, this provides visibility into what types of content have been discovered, what they've been labeled as, and where the content is. So in this case, we're looking at things like, was it copied to a USB? Was it uploaded to a third-party cloud? Was it shared externally, and so on? Now, I mentioned sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels, when a sensitivity label is applied to an email or a document, any of the configured protection settings that are defined for that label are then enforced on the content of the document. So you can configure a sensitivity label to do something like encrypt the content or protect the content in Teams or SharePoint Online. You can apply a watermark to the content. You may automatically apply labels to email if it contains certain information, like a social security number or a credit card number. You can apply that label automatically. When content has retention settings or retention policies assigned to it, the content will remain in the original location. So a person can continue to work with the document or the email, and it doesn't appear as though anything has changed from the end user's perspective. It's behaving as it always has. However, if it has a retention policy or retention label applied to it, if the end user tries to edit or delete the content that's included in that document, a copy of the content is automatically retained that's not visible to the end user. So you have a log of the changes that were made to the document by virtue of those retention policies and labels. Records management in Microsoft 365 helps an organization to manage their legal obligations, helps them to demonstrate compliance with regulations, and helps to manage the disposition of items that perhaps no longer need to be retained. Maybe they're no longer of any value. They no longer are needed for business purposes. So this helps you to manage the life cycle of your data. And then lastly, data loss prevention is a fairly self-explanatory phrase. The idea here is to protect sensitive information from inadvertent disclosure. So when you have DLP policies in place, your admins can identify, monitor, and automatically protect sensitive information that might exist in resources like OneDrive, SharePoint Online, Teams, Exchange Online, and make sure that that data doesn't leave the organization inadvertently. Another area that's going to be important to understand is insider risk. So the insider risk management solutions in Microsoft 365 can help minimize the internal risks for an organization by enabling them to act on risky and malicious activities by their users. So for example, you might identify risks from illegal behavior or inappropriate behavior, unethical behavior, and actions by an employee or manager in your organization. Communication compliance, it helps you to minimize communication risks by, again, detecting and acting on inappropriate messages in your organization. It is important to know that you have to enable the audit log in order for communication compliance to work right. So the way this works is you would define whose communication you want to monitor, in other words, what user or group, and then you can decide how you want to monitor. Do you want to monitor only inbound communication, only outbound communication, only internal communication? What are the sensitive information types you want to look for? Do you want to review all of their communications or just a percentage of them? Just spot checking, you might say. With information barriers, you can explicitly define policies that prevent certain groups of users in your organization from communicating with other groups. Or you can allow specific segments to communicate only with certain other segments. So the purpose behind information barriers is helping you to maintain compliance with certain industry standards and regulations that govern conflicts of interest. And you do need to have scoped directory search turned on in order for information barriers to work. Privileged access management, we kind of referred to this a little while ago in the identity and access management area. Again, users request access to an elevated or privileged capability, and then from there, they are granted access for a period of time, and then that privilege or that privilege access is revoked. Customer lockbox kind of builds on that same model, except that it applies to Microsoft. So from time to time, an organization will contact Microsoft support for help. And if the Microsoft engineer needs access to some of the data in the customer organization, if they have customer lockbox turned on, then there is a formal process that the Microsoft engineer has to go through in order to access that data while they're troubleshooting an issue. So the Microsoft engineer would submit a customer lockbox request. That request would go to the Microsoft engineer's manager. The manager would validate that the engineer needs to have that access in order to troubleshoot the issue. They would say, yes, I approve this request. The request then goes to the customer, and the customer also has to approve the request. When they get this request, notice that it is time bound. So the engineer is given whatever this is, 4 hours, access to a specific service, and all of this information is captured in the audit log. So we know who has access to user data and when and for how long. Sometimes a company may become involved in litigation and they need to find data that can be used as evidence. And so e-discovery tools can be used to search for content across Microsoft 365 in your Exchange Online, Teams, SharePoint, Skype for Business, Yammer, in a variety of different repositories. You can search across mailboxes and SharePoint sites in a single e-discovery search by using the content search tool. And you can use the core e-discovery workflow to identify, put on hold, and export content that's found in mailboxes or SharePoint sites. So you'll need to understand the flow of the core e-discovery process. You'll need to know the same thing for the advanced e-discovery workflow. Fundamentally, it's the same thing, but there are a few additional steps, primarily around who the data custodian is, in other words, who's responsible for handling and processing the data from a legal standpoint. Now, this image is not very easy to read, so if you click on this link, it'll give you a bigger view of this model. The audit functionality in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center allows organizations to view user and administrator activity using a unified audit log. So when an audited activity is performed by a user or an administrator, there is an audit record generated, and it's stored in the audit log for the organization. The length of time that that audit record is kept and the length of time that it's therefore searchable in the audit log depends on the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 subscription that they're licensed for, and specifically the type of license that is assigned to specific users. So for your core auditing capabilities, the audit record is kept and searchable for 90 days. That's the default. Advanced audit, on the other hand, can help an organization who might be conducting forensic investigations or compliance investigations. And the way it does this is by increasing the retention time for audit logs that might be required to perform those investigations. So advanced audit keeps all your Exchange, SharePoint, and Azure Active Directory audit records for a year, right? So you've got a default 1-year retention of audited data. You also have the capability to keep audit logs for 10 years with an additional add-on license if that's required from an audit perspective. The other interesting thing that this advanced audit capability provides is the high bandwidth access to the Office 365 Activity API. So customers are able to perform faster searches of the Office 365 audit logs if they're licensed for advanced audit. Now for our last slide here, we're going to be talking about Azure. And there are different ways you can govern your resources in Azure depending on the requirements for your organization, as well as the licensing that you've got. Azure resource locks are used to prevent resources from being accidentally deleted or modified. So the question might be posed, well, wait a minute, didn't we talk about role-based access control earlier that restricted users access to these things? That's true, but even if you have role-based access control policies in place, there's still a risk that the people with the correct level of access could still accidentally delete or incorrectly modify a critical resource. And so Azure resource locks prevent users from deleting or modifying any critical resource on an accidental basis, right? So if a user is malicious, they can turn off the lock and do something bad, but primarily Azure resource locks are helping to prevent accidental modifications. Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints, just like a blueprint for a house, is a way of defining a repeatable set of deployed resources. So with Azure Blueprints, you can quickly provision a new environment that has certain characteristics. And this will give you the knowledge that they are in line with the organization's compliance requirements. So you design a blueprint to match a set of compliance requirements, and then you deploy based on that blueprint. So you can think of Azure Blueprints as ensuring that what should get deployed is equal to what actually gets deployed. Azure Policy helps you to enforce compliance standards and assess compliance at scale. So it will give you an aggregated view that lets you see the overall status of the environment, and you can even drill down into individual resources or individual policies at a very granular level. And then if you see that there are areas where you're out of compliance, you can perform bulk remediation using an Azure policy. The last topic here is Cloud Adoption Framework. Cloud Adoption Framework is a set of best practices, documentation, different tools that a cloud architect, a business decision maker, a consultant can use to help create and implement the business and technology strategies that are needed in order to be successful with a cloud deployment. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is big, right? You're not going to be expected to know all the details of it. What you might need to know is the purpose of it. Why do we have a Cloud Adoption Framework? What's the point of its existence? Okay, so hopefully this has been helpful in guiding you in preparing for the SC-900 exam. Here is where the deck is located in PDF format. Remember, this exam covers a lot of topics, but it only goes into them at a superficial level. Generally speaking, you just need to understand the use cases for a specific technology and the general requirements to get something up and running, the licensing, the hardware and software requirements. You're not typically going to be asked the nitty-gritty details of the technology, which button to push, which knob to turn. That's not the purpose of this exam. If you want the PDF of the deck, as I said, you can download it from the link that's shown here on the slide. And with that, I want to say thank you, and I hope you do well on the exam.